Terry Kolath with Professor Adrian Keir, and we're going to be talking about Singapore and Stanford Raffles in the next course in the Academy of Lifelong Learning. Thank you for joining me, Adrian.
Thank you, Terry, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be at Shell Point.
Now, Stanford Raffles is the name when you're looking at Singapore.
It is. That is a lot of tradition. There's the Raffles Hotel still there. There are statues, 2 statues of Raffles, and it owes its founding to this strange Englishman who was born in England and decided to have a career in the East. And today, that's quite a stretch, but in the early 1800s, people, instead of going west, young man, they would go east to look at opportunities to make money and have a career, and they went for life. They weren't just going for 2 or 3 years like modern expatriates, they went for good. And he rose in the ranks of the colonial government in what is today the islands of Indonesia, but at that time was split between the great powers in the east, which were the Dutch and the English. England was trying to establish secure trading ports on the way to eventually Hong Kong, moving gradually further east, and the Straits of Malacca were contested between the pirates, who are still around, and the Dutch on the south side and the Brits on the north side. And so the Brits established the base of Penang, which is a beautiful island just off Malaysia in the north, and they had parts of Sumatra. When the Napoleonic Wars took place, then suddenly Britain saw an opportunity to grab part of those islands, and Stanford Raffles ran that quite successfully, and he became effectively the governor of what we call Java today, and accidentally, one of his weekend trips, came across the great temples of Borobudur, which we talk about in a separate, one of the finest Buddhist temples lost in the woods of Java. And he wrote the history of Java, which is still a recognized work today, even though it's many years out of date. When the war was over and the Dutch took back, the Brits did a deal with the Dutch. They said, why don't we do a land swap? You can have all of Indonesia, the bits that we had, and give Stanford Raffles the job of finding a suitable port further down the Malay Peninsula. And that was his task. So off he went, and he talked to various landowners, and the only deal he could strike was right at the bottom end of the tip of Malaysia, or Malaya, was a swampy little island which nobody really wanted, was hardly inhabited, and he did a deal with the British government and the local landowner to buy Singapore. And that's exactly how it started. Wow. He was a man of great ethical judgment, and he said, and he raised 2 or 3 important issues, which he said, if this is going to be a new city-state, there are going to be some rules. And he set up the concept that there was no slavery. He said that all religions are welcome, all ethnic groups are welcome, and it's a free port. Now, that was quite unusual because ports tended to be having to pay import duty or export costs. So he said, no, this is a free trade port, one of the earliest in the world. And that was the basis for its huge success. He also had discovered an island which has a very, very fine set of harbors, and it's still one of its strengths today. So he started with his colleague and wrote out a plan for Singapore, and that was followed for the first 30 years. And it's quite curious looking back and how that segregation was alive and well in those days, and that he said, this is the colonial area where administration shall be, City Hall, courts, etc., Governor's Palace. Nobody can build a house there. But the Europeans can have this sector, the Chinese can have this sector, and the Indians can have this sector, and that's where they live. And to this day, it's still called Chinatown or Indian Town, but all religions are welcome. And so you have this curiosity in the middle of Singapore today, the old street, where you have on one street, which is only about 600 yards long, you have a Christian church, you have an Islamic mosque, and you have a Buddhist temple. And you can go bing, bing, bing.
Interesting.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
Oh my God.
So Singapore grew and grew with its great foundation. And today, of course, it's a wonderful trading port. Lots of industry there too. And it's become one of these super success stories out of what could have been a disaster, because when Britain gave up its Eastern Empire, the area we call Malaysia today, which is Malay, the Malaysian Peninsula, plus some islands of Borneo and elsewhere, they included Singapore in this deal. But the people of Malaya leaned at that time towards the Bumi Putra, which is men of the soil, the locals, whereas the Chinese and Indians had moved in under British rule and were doing very well, businesses and such. And so the locals were getting disgruntled that they were not getting a fair crack of the whip at colleges, and so they did reverse discrimination and gave them preferences. And there were banks set up, and still are banks in Malaya, where you have to be a local citizen for many generations to be able to bank there.
Interesting.
And so they imposed this on all of Malaysia, and the leader, the Prime Minister of Singapore said, wait a minute, that might work for you guys on the mainland, but here we're based on international, have been since Stamford Raffles set the place up. So Lee Kuan Yew was the Prime Minister, and he effectively was kicked out of Malaysia. Now, at the time, if you were betting, you'd say that's the end of Singapore. But in fact, it's the beginning of the huge success story of what it is today.
This is a fascinating story. A fascinating story. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, because if you go to Singapore, it's beautifully run, it's super clean. If you drop chewing gum on the street, you get fined. If you drop cigarettes on the street, you get fined. If you jaywalk, you get fined. And there's this dichotomy between the adults and the youngsters. The adults think this is great. You can walk the streets. There's drug smuggling is treated very harshly. Any crimes are treated very harshly. It's clean, it's well run. If you're a youngster, it doesn't quite fit. You want a bit more liberal views. And so you have this conflict, if you like, which is growing about should Singapore be the old colonial Victorian style of management, or should it become more westernized?
The plot thickens.
The plot thickens.
Won't you join Professor Adrian Keir on Tuesday, October 16th for Stamford Raffles, The Story of Singapore.